Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the communication department for kind of hosting this evening. Thank you all for coming. Even though I am from rival schools, working at Biola and having gone to Wheaton, I still hold Westmont in high esteem, and I know it's one of the best Christian schools there is, so it's a great honor to be asked to come speak to you guys. I love speaking at Christian colleges, and I've spoken at a lot of them over the last year and a half since the book came out. And I love it because I think this book, in many ways, speaks directly to you guys. The Christian college atmosphere tends to be a kind of a thriving hotbed of Christian hipster activity, and I saw it a lot at Wheaton when I was a student, and I see it at Biola, and I'm sure the Christian hipster exists in great number here as well. But you guys can speak to that better than I can. So tonight I'm going to talk about Christian cool, or more specifically, what the intersection is between Christianity and the idea of cool. Is it something that should exist? What should we think about that? And I think we should approach this topic critically. There is no easy answers, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion with the students and with you guys later, because I think it's a pretty rich and complicated subject. So what got me interested in Christian cool started with a general interest in just the idea of cool philosophically, kind of existentially. Where does this drive to want to be different and set apart from the mainstream come from? What does it mean for us culturally? How is it defined in different cultures? And then what does it mean for us theologically and spiritually? And that's really the question that led me to want to write Hipster Christianity, and it's the question that I want to explore with you tonight. Now, I imagine that you guys have all, I forgot to do this little image here. I imagine that you guys have all experienced hipster Christianity to some extent. Maybe you've gone to a hipster church, or you have a hipster worship pastor. We talked about that at dinner, how a lot of worship pastors tend to have the skinny jeans, V-neck, big hair, tattoos, bearded look. So maybe you've seen that. Maybe you have a pastor who tries to be cool and name drops, bands like Arcade Fire and uses David Lynch movies as sermon illustrations. If you've seen that, you've seen hipster Christianity in action in some way. I think at Christian colleges, something that I've observed is this transition that happens from freshman year to senior year, where a lot of times you have students that come in their freshman year looking a little bit like this. Here's an example. So kind of clean cut, very evangelical looking, maybe a little idealistic, naive. Maybe they don't actually look like that, but that's just kind of an exaggeration. But then something happens in the 4 years of being a student in a Christian college. You distance yourselves visually, idealistically. You rebel you try to distance yourself from the evangelical stereotype. So maybe by the time you're a senior, you look something maybe more like this. So just kind of thrift store clothes, beards, tattoos, just kind of an overall sullen, jaded countenance. So if you guys have seen that transition happen, and I'm guessing you have, you've seen hipster Christianity in action. Now, it's also in other areas of culture that you might have encountered. Maybe you've read Relevant Magazine. Maybe you've seen Shane Claiborne speak or read his books, or Rob Bell. Or maybe you've listened to the music of Sufjan Stevens, who was just playing a few minutes ago. So all of these things are kind of cultural artifacts of hipster Christianity. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying any of this is bad. In fact, I think a lot of this is great. I've written for Relevant Magazine for about 8 years. I love Sufjan Stevens. So I'm not saying any of these things are bad, just that they kind of serve to help us understand what this idea of cool Christianity is. They're cultural artifacts that help us classify things. And by classifying things, it doesn't necessarily mean a value judgment. So I just want to make that clear before we go any further. Okay, so in my talk today, I really want to get at the heart of this tension between cool and Christianity. And the way I want to go about doing that is by going through specific attributes or characteristics of cool on one hand. What does that mean? And then Christianity. What does it mean to follow Christ on the other? So first, what are some characteristics of pursuing cool? And this is kind of the way culture defines it, and it's a little bit extreme, but for the sake of comparison, I'm just going to go with this. So the first attribute of pursuing cool is self-obsessed. The pursuit of cool tends to be a very individualistic endeavor. It's all about us being different and us being set apart from the pack, being different than the mainstream. It's about having totally unique style and an aesthetic that no one else can claim. So it tends to be kind of a vain, narcissistic thing because cool is so much defined these days by your visible appearance. It requires you to spend just a lot of time thinking about your visual image, how you present yourselves to the world. And the irony is, one of the hipster looks these days is kind of this just rolled out of bed, I didn't try too hard look, but even that is a very self-conscious, strategic look. And this whole idea of wanting to be cool and defining yourselves through your image, it means you have to spend more time thinking about yourself than perhaps you should. So a second characteristic of cool, pursuing cool, is this idea of exclusivity. And this is fundamental to what cool is and what it has been historically. It's something that has to be a minority. Not everyone can be allowed inside the inner circle. The very existence of cool is kind of founded on this in versus out binary, okay? So it's not a very welcoming, inviting sort of thing. And along with that, cool tends to be elitist. To be cool is to have this air of kind of privileged knowledge. I have better taste than you. I know, what's fashionable and what's cool, and you guys don't. So it tends to create this separation of those in the know and those who are kind of cultural Philistines. And because cool is exclusive and elitist, it also tends to be alienating. For those on the outside, for those outside of the circle, it's not a very welcoming thing. I went to some churches, for example, in the research for hipster Christianity, and there were so many fashionable, cool-looking hipsters there. It was all 20-something hipsters, and for an outsider, imagine if you're like a soccer mom or someone who's just not a hipster. You can't help but feel alienated from that environment. And even if once she got to know the congregation, they ended up being perhaps the nicest people on earth, just the visible thing that is being connoted in their appearance tends to be alienating. So I think that's a fundamental aspect of cool. Okay, so another attribute that I think is pretty fundamental to cool is this idea of transience. It's always changing because the minute something trendy or fashionable becomes known by too many people, what happens? The cool people have to move on to something else. So it tends to be this very fast-moving cycle. And if you look at the fashion world, it's structured in these quick, trendy seasons where something's cool one season, but then it moves on because if something lands on the shelves of JCPenney or Old Navy, it's not cool, and so you have to move on to something else. So there's this fundamental transience, ephemerality to the whole thing. And then my final characteristic is this kind of irony, jadedness that tends to go along with cool. To be cool is to approach everything with a little bit of a wink, because the world has proven to be so phony and so disingenuous. It's a protective posture where we don't take anything seriously because so much in the world is just ridiculous and phony. To be sincere is almost kind of a position of weakness where you're ceding something to the system if you're sincere or earnest. Okay, so those are some attributes of cool. Now let me contrast those with some characteristics of pursuing Christ. So in contrast to cool's kind of self-obsession, I would say one attribute of Christianity is selflessness. If we are really serious about following the example of Christ's life, we have to recognize that we can't be obsessed with ourselves. Rather, we have to deny ourselves. We're called to deny ourselves, take up our crosses. In the letter to the Philippians, Paul instructs Christians to, quote, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. So I think throughout Scripture, there's just a lot of verses about kind of denying yourself. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. And I think that's just hard maybe to reconcile with the kind of vanity and narcissism that comes with cool. Second contrasting characteristic is that Christianity is inclusive. It's open to everyone. In contrast to the exclusive club nature of cool, Christianity, the gospel, it does away with barriers. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, nor male or female, if you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's the core of the gospel. Jesus said, whosoever comes to me will be saved, not just those who wear the right clothes or say the right things. So I think if you contrast what Christianity is, it's inclusive, it's open to anyone, to cool, which is fundamentally exclusive. There's definitely some dissonance there. So in contrast to elitism, again, humility. This is a fundamental characteristic of Christianity. In Romans 12, we're told that we should not think of ourselves more highly than we ought. And, in Colossians, Paul says that the people of God should put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility. So humility is a fundamental characteristic of what it means to follow Christ. So I think we need to remember that when we think about what cool is and how it appears to the world as this very elitist, haughty sort of thing. So the fourth characteristic is in contrast to the alienating nature of cool. I already went through that, sorry. The fifth characteristic is this idea that Christianity is transcendent. So in contrast to the transient, ephemeral nature of cool, Christianity is transcendent. It's lasted for thousands of years. It will outlast the universe. It's something that offers something a little more substantive and long-lasting than the transient nature of cool. And then finally, where cool is about kind of this ironic, sarcastic posture, Christianity is fundamentally an earnest, sincere calling. The idea of the resurrection, which is fundamental to our faith, is one of hope. We are people that look forward and we believe in things. And I think to be a Christian and to kind of have this posture of jaded cynicism, sarcasm, I don't think that necessarily jives so well with what we're called to be and what our faith is all about. Okay, so having gone through that, I hope you can see that there is definite dissonance between Christianity and cool. But I don't want to write off the notion that perhaps Christian cool can exist in some manifestation. I just think that we have to not strive for cool as it was defined there. We can't strive to be cool as such. What we should strive for is to be faithful, gospel-centered people. And if that ends up being cool, then great. Then there is sort of a different aspect of cool that we can be as Christians. So here's a quote from my book. I say, if cool Christianity exists, it will not be because this is how we've packaged it and sold it. It will rather be an organic phenomenon that happens because of the nature of the community that the gospel has entered and transformed. Or it will be an outgrowth of the nature of the gospel itself, which is certainly counter to the prevailing mainstream values of the world. So I think one of the things we need to think about is how we define relevance. So our culture defines relevance as being kind of with it or up on the current trends. And a lot of Christians these days, a lot of pastors ascribe to that view of relevance. They want their church to be relevant by ascribing to the current zeitgeist, the pop culture trends. But I think as Christians, we need to think about relevance in a bigger way. Our true relevance as Christians comes from a deeper place. It comes from the core of the gospel. It isn't a fad. It isn't something that's going to change in 5 minutes. So when we're talking about Christianity's true cool, I think there's some things we could say that are legitimately cool about Christianity. And I'm going to just mention 3 of them here. So one thing I think that is truly cool about Christianity, and I hope you can see that, but is its selflessness. So Christianity is fundamentally a self-effacing, others-focused religion. It isn't primarily about our individual happiness, but it's about the power of the mission of God that we are invited to be a part of. So where cool emphasizes the self, and it's all about elevating the self in this elitist kind of I'm hipper than you way, Christianity emphasizes community. It emphasizes others. So in our culture today, I think this is a truly countercultural thing because our culture tells us, the whole world should revolve around you. You should do what's in your best interest. It should all be about flattering yourself and kind of drawing attention to yourself and standing out from the pack. But Christianity kind of frees us from that. That can be kind of just a constraining thing. But Christianity frees us from the burden of narcissism, and it focuses us mercifully on something bigger and grander than ourselves. So another characteristic of Christianity that I think is truly cool is that it's lasting. And again, this goes back to the contrast between transcendence and ephemerality. Something that's in our culture today, which is so fast-moving and so disposable, Christianity offers something that is solid and grounded, and it's been around for 2,000 years, and it's destined to outlive the universe. It's a good news that transcends any trend. And I think that's a truly countercultural attribute that we should cling to and point to when we're thinking about relevance. And finally, I would say that perhaps this is the most important one, but Christianity is truly transforming. It changes lives. It's about true transformation. It isn't about this kind of dressing up to fit the current zeitgeist. It's about putting off the old self, putting on the new self, becoming a new creation, being freed from sin, opened up to new life in a way that's more profound than any sort of trendy kind of cool could ever satisfy. So in conclusion, I just want to say a few things before we get to the discussion. I'm not saying here that culture isn't important. I think that's important to get out there. Or that the church or Christians shouldn't be attuned to trends or the cultural zeitgeist. I think that is hugely important for a couple of reasons. For one, in the way that we contextualize the communication of the gospel, we do need to kind of be savvy to what the trends are and how the culture relates in communication. So it's important for that reason, but also just in the way that we respond to the beauty of God's creation. We should be interested in art. We should be interested in fashion, music, all these other things. But it should always be because those things are good, because we see the value in them and truly appreciate them. It shouldn't be because they're cool or because they give us some sort of stature or status, which is kind of what cool is about. It's about using culture kind of in a mercenary way to make yourself elevated in some way. So in our world today, it's easy to define ourselves in terms of consumption. And I think if you think about what hipsters are in our culture, it's very much defined through the terms of consumption. It's about liking certain bands, wearing certain brands, eating certain food. So it's all about our consumptive habits. And if you look at like Facebook, how do we define ourselves on Facebook these days? Our profile pages, it's through our likes. It's like an ingredient listing of consumer habits. It's the music we like, the bands we like, the books, the movies. But isn't our identity deeper than that? As Christians, I think we need to realize that our identity comes from Christ. It doesn't come from our cultural and consumer habits. It comes from the saving power of the Holy Spirit, which has transformed us and invited us to join in this amazing, world-changing mission of God. So I just want to encourage you guys, because as college students, you're in this stage in life where you're figuring out your identity and you're trying to break away from how you were defined in high school and with your family. And I've been there. I'm still there to some extent. I just want to encourage you, as you think about your identity and where you derive your value and your identity, and maybe you think about what desires are motivating your choices, your consumer choices, for example, ask yourself questions like, am I dressing in a certain way, purchasing a certain product because I want to impress people, because I want to convey some sort of rebellion? Am I trying to make a statement? Or is it because I have a desire for the world's affirmation? Do I want their respect or envy? Or are my actions motivated by an earnest desire to represent Christ in the world? Again, we live in a world that tells us we are the centers of our own universe, that everything we do should be about puffing ourselves up and drawing attention to ourselves. And I want to challenge you to live in an opposite way to this, okay? Live as living sacrifices. I think this ultimately is going to be the most countercultural thing that the world can see in a Christian. And it's a hard thing to do in a world that tells us you are important, you need to impress people, you need to communicate greatness through your way of dress and your great taste in music, but live as a living sacrifice. I think that's ultimately going to be the most countercultural thing you can do. So thank you. That's my talk. And